The clock read 8:42 a.m. as Kendrick Robinson parked his car outside the municipal courthouse in Greenville, South Carolina. The warm morning sunlight cast long shadows across the asphalt, and Kendrick exhaled deeply. He hated being late. As a federal prosecutor, his professional life revolved around discipline and preparedness. But today, life had conspired against him. An urgent phone call about an ongoing human trafficking case had delayed him. The defense team had filed a last-minute motion he couldn't ignore. This wasn't supposed to be complicated. The task ahead was mundane, challenging an error in a property tax adjustment on the house his grandmother left him. The city had raised the taxes inexplicably, and Kendrick had spent weeks gathering proof it was a mistake. The house was more than property. It was the anchor of his childhood, the place where he'd learned right from wrong under his grandmother's watchful eye. Dressed in a dark navy suit with a crisp white shirt, Kendrick looked every bit the seasoned attorney he was, even if his morning had been chaotic. He checked his watch. 8:50 a.m. 10 minutes to spare. Barely. The municipal court wasn't like the federal courts where Kendrick spent most of his days. The walls were dull beige, the seats scuffed from decades of use. The air smelled faintly of coffee and old paper. Despite its worn appearance, the place buzzed with activity. People shuffled in and out, clutching stacks of documents, faces etched with anxiety over parking tickets, minor disputes, and other small claims. Kendrick found his courtroom, room 204, Judge Charles Whitman presiding. He adjusted his tie and stepped inside. The courtroom was already filling. Kendrick found a spot near the back and sat down, reviewing his evidence. As he scanned his notes, he noticed the judge entering. Judge Charles Whitman, a tall man with a silver mane and piercing blue eyes, commanded attention without saying a word. His reputation as a no-nonsense figure was evident in the way he scanned the room, his sharp gaze missing nothing. The bailiff's voice rang out, "All rise!" Kendrick stood with the others, his posture straight. Judge Whitman settled into his chair, and an uncomfortable silence followed. The judge began calling cases one by one with mechanical efficiency, his tone crisp and detached. Kendrick watched closely. A middle-aged white man in a suit arrived a few minutes late, shuffled in unnoticed. Moments later, a young white woman in casual clothes slipped in and took a seat. Neither received so much as a glance from the judge. Then, at 9:15 a.m., Kendrick heard his name called. He gathered his folder and walked to the podium, projecting calm despite the slight delay. As he approached, Judge Whitman looked up, his expression hardening. "You're late, Mr. Robinson," the judge said sharply. "Do you think the court's time is less valuable than your own?" Kendrick raised his hand slightly, palms out. "Your Honor, I apologize for the delay. I was attending to urgent federal matters." "Excuses don't excuse tardiness," Whitman interrupted. "This court operates on order and respect. If you can't follow that, I suggest you reevaluate your priorities." Kendrick felt the weight of dozens of eyes on him. He maintained his composure, choosing his words carefully. "Your Honor, I understand the importance of timeliness. If I may, I'd like to present my case regarding the property tax adjustment." Whitman waved a hand dismissively. "We'll get to that. First, there's the matter of contempt. Tardiness undermines the integrity of these proceedings. You are hereby fined $750. The words hung in the air like a hammer strike. Kendrick's jaw tightened slightly, but he kept his expression neutral. Around him, murmurs rippled through the room. "Your Honor," Kendrick began, his tone measured. "May I explain the circumstances?" "You may not," Whitman said, raising his gavel. "Consider this a lesson in respecting the court." Kendrick stepped back, his mind racing. This wasn't just about tardiness, it was about something deeper. He glanced at the other latecomers, none of whom had been reprimanded. The disparity was glaring. As he returned to his seat, Kendrick opened his folder, but this time it wasn't the property tax documents he focused on. He began jotting notes, his pen moving swiftly. Judge Whitman continued with the next case, his voice unwavering, but Kendrick's attention was elsewhere. This was no ordinary morning, and Kendrick knew exactly what was happening. The question was, what would he do about it? The pattern became clearer with each passing case. Kendrick watched as a young white woman stumbled through an explanation about a parking violation, clearly unprepared. Judge Whitman sighed, but simply reduced her fine. A white man in his 30s contested a traffic ticket with barely any evidence. The judge granted a continuance without question. But when an older black woman approached about a zoning dispute, Whitman's demeanor shifted. His questions were sharper, his patience thinner. When she asked for a payment plan due to financial hardship, he denied it outright. Kendrick's legal mind cataloged every interaction, every disparity. This wasn't isolated incompetence. It was systematic bias. When his name was called again, Kendrick approached the podium with his evidence organized and his argument prepared. Your Honor, I have documentation regarding the erroneous property tax adjustment. Let's address the elephant in the room first, Whitman interrupted. You're questioning my authority, aren't you, Mr. Robinson? Kendrick's eyebrows raised slightly. Your Honor, I'm simply presenting my case. You're upset about the fine. You think it was unfair. I think, Kendrick said carefully, that consistency in how rules are applied is fundamental to justice. Whitman's face darkened. Are you suggesting this court is inconsistent? I'm suggesting that I observed multiple people arrive after me who received no penalty whatsoever. The courtroom went completely silent. Those were different circumstances, Whitman said, his voice tight. Different how, Your Honor? The judge's knuckles whitened as he gripped his gavel. Mr. Robinson, I will not tolerate accusations in my courtroom. I'm not making accusations, Kendrick interrupted, his prosecutor's training taking over. I'm asking for clarification. What made my tardiness worthy of a $750 fine while others' tardiness warranted no response? Whitman leaned forward, his face flushed. Your attitude, counselor. Your clear disrespect for this court's authority. My attitude? Kendrick's voice remained level, but steel had entered it. Your Honor, I've been nothing but respectful. I apologized. I explained my circumstances, and I attempted to present my case. What specifically about my demeanor has been disrespectful? The judge opened his mouth, then closed it. The trap was closing, and he could feel it. You're wasting this court's time with frivolous objections. Objecting to selective enforcement isn't frivolous, Kendrick said. It's fundamental to due process. A woman in the gallery pulled out her phone, beginning to record. Others followed suit. The modern courthouse, where everyone had a camera, was about to become Judge Whitman's worst nightmare. Put those phones away, Whitman barked. This is a public proceeding, someone called out. We have the right to record. Whitman's control was slipping. He turned back to Kendrick, fury barely contained. Mr. Robinson, you are treading on very thin ice. Your Honor, Kendrick said, his voice carrying across the courtroom, I'm an assistant United States attorney for the Northern District of South Carolina. I've prosecuted cases in federal court for over a decade. I know what due process looks like, and I know when it's being violated. The revelation hit the courtroom like a thunderclap. Judge Whitman's face went from red to pale in seconds. You're a federal prosecutor? Yes, Your Honor. And as an officer of the court, I have an obligation to report patterns of bias and discrimination when I encounter them. Whitman's hand trembled slightly as he set down his gavel. There must be some misunderstanding. The only misunderstanding is yours, Kendrick said quietly. You saw a black man walk into your courtroom and made assumptions. You decided I deserved punishment that you would never impose on others, and now you're realizing you made a mistake. The phones kept recording. The audience was transfixed. What happened here today isn't unique, Kendrick continued, addressing the entire courtroom now. This is what happens when people in power believe they're above accountability. When they think their authority means they can treat people differently based on race. I am not a racist, Whitman said, but his voice lacked conviction. Then explain the disparity, Your Honor. Explain why my lateness, while handling a federal human trafficking case, warranted a $750 fine, while others' tardiness warranted nothing. Whitman couldn't answer. "I'll be filing a formal complaint with the Judicial Review Commission," Kendrick said. "I'll be requesting a complete audit of your courtroom proceedings for the past 5 years, and I'll be recommending that every case you've presided over involving people of color be reviewed for bias." The judge slumped in his chair, the weight of consequences finally hitting him. "But first," Kendrick said, pulling out his property tax documents, "I'd like to present my actual case. The one I came here for, unless you're recusing yourself due to obvious conflict of interest." Whitman looked at the papers, then at Kendrick, then at the room full of recording phones. "Case dismissed," he whispered. "I'm sorry, Your Honor. I didn't hear that." "Your case," Whitman said louder, his voice hollow, "is dismissed. The tax adjustment is clearly erroneous. The city will be ordered to correct it immediately. Thank you, Your Honor." Kendrick gathered his papers. "And the $750 fine?" "Vacated. Completely vacated. Noted for the record." As Kendrick walked out of the courtroom, the audience erupted, not in applause but in a collective release of held breath. Several people approached him, sharing their own stories of how Whitman had treated them unfairly. An elderly black man pulled Kendrick aside. "Thank you. I've been coming to this court for 40 years. I've seen so much injustice, but I never thought anyone would finally call it out." Kendrick placed a hand on the man's shoulder. "It should never have taken this long." The story spread rapidly. By noon, local news had picked it up. By evening, it was national. The video footage from multiple phones painted a clear picture. A judge with a pattern of discriminatory behavior finally confronted by someone with the knowledge and authority to challenge him. The Judicial Review Commission acted swiftly. Within 2 weeks, an investigation was launched. Kendrick's request for a 5-year audit was granted. What they found was damning. Hundreds of cases showing clear racial disparities in fines, sentencing recommendations, and treatment of defendants. Judge Whitman announced his retirement, but the investigation continued. Several of his cases were overturned. Families who had suffered under his bias finally saw justice. But for Kendrick, the real victory came 3 months later, when he stood before a law school class sharing his experience. Justice, he told the students, isn't just about knowing the law. It's about having the courage to challenge injustice when you see it, regardless of the personal cost. A young black woman in the front row raised her hand. "Weren't you afraid?" "He was a judge. He had power over you." Kendrick smiled. He had temporary power in a municipal courtroom. "I had something more valuable: the truth, the law, and the willingness to stand up for what's right." He paused, looking at the diverse faces before him. "That's what I want you to remember. Titles and positions can be intimidating, but they don't override the fundamental principles of justice. When you see discrimination, when you witness bias, when you observe power being abused, you have an obligation to act. Even if it costs you," another student asked, "especially if it costs you." Because silence costs far more. It costs the next person who faces that bias. It costs the integrity of the entire justice system. It costs us all our humanity. The students were silent, absorbing his words. What happened to Judge Whitman wasn't about revenge. It was about accountability, about ensuring that the system works for everyone, not just those who look a certain way or come from certain backgrounds. Years later, Kendrick would still receive messages from people who'd been in that courtroom. Some thanked him for exposing Whitman. Others shared how his stand inspired them to challenge injustice in their own lives. But the message that meant the most came from an unexpected source: Judge Whitman himself, 2 years after his retirement. "Mr. Robinson," the letter began, "I don't expect forgiveness, nor do I deserve it. But I wanted you to know that your courage to confront me forced me to confront myself. I spent my career believing I was impartial, fair, just. You showed me the truth I'd been avoiding, that bias can exist even when we believe we're being objective. I'm donating my pension to organizations fighting judicial bias. It's not enough. It never will be, but it's something. Thank you for having the strength to do what I should have done myself: demand better from our justice system." Kendrick kept that letter, not as a trophy, but as a reminder. Change was possible, even for those who seemed beyond reach. And sometimes, the bravest thing you could do was simply stand up and say, "This isn't right." The municipal courthouse in Greenville eventually got a new judge, a woman of color with a reputation for fairness and compassion. The $750 fine that was meant to silence Kendrick became the catalyst for transformation. Because that's how justice works. Not always quickly, not always easily, but inevitably, when people refuse to accept injustice as normal. If this story resonated with you, remember, you don't need to be a federal prosecutor to demand fairness. You don't need a law degree to recognize discrimination. You just need the courage to speak up when something isn't right. Share this story with someone who needs to remember that standing up for justice isn't just the right thing to do. It's the only thing that creates real change. Subscribe to Real Justice Stories for more tales of courage, accountability, and the power of refusing to accept injustice. Because real justice doesn't come from the bench. It comes from the people who demand it. Thank you for watching. Remember, silence protects the powerful. Your voice protects everyone else.